It was a cold and silent night. I was coming back from a long day at work, and all I wanted was to get home, take a hot shower, and sleep. My apartment was on a secluded street, a bit dark and surrounded by tall trees, which always gave me a strange feeling. But that night, the feeling was different. There was something in the air that made me feel like I was being watched. As soon as I got home, I locked the door and collapsed on the couch. The sense of relief was immediate, but at the same time, I couldn't shake off that uneasiness. I looked out the window and everything seemed normal. The street was deserted, the trees swayed gently with the wind, and nothing indicated that something was wrong. But then, I heard it. It was a low sound, almost imperceptible, coming from the hallway outside my apartment. It sounded like a whisper, as if someone was speaking quietly, trying not to be heard. I stood up slowly and went to the door. I pressed my ear against the wood and stood still, trying to identify what it was. The whisper continued, but I couldn't make out the words. I took a deep breath and decided to open the door. The hallway was dark. The light bulbs on that floor always failed, but that night it was worse. Only one bulb at the end of the corridor was flickering, creating shadows that seemed to move on their own. I looked in both directions and saw no one. I decided to go back inside and lock the door. It must be just my imagination, I thought. I went back to the couch, trying to convince myself that everything was fine. I turned on the TV to try to distract myself, but the sound of the whispers returned. This time, it seemed to be inside the apartment. My heart started to beat faster, and I began to sweat cold. I got up and started walking around the living room, trying to locate the source of the sound. It seemed to come from the bedroom. I walked slowly down the hallway to the bedroom door. It was slightly ajar, which was strange since I was sure I had left it closed. I pushed the door carefully, and it creaked like in a horror movie. The room was dark, but I could see a shadow in the corner, near the wardrobe. It was a human silhouette, motionless, just standing there. My blood ran cold. "Who's there?" I asked, trying not to let my voice tremble. The shadow didn't answer, but the whispers stopped. The silence that followed was even more terrifying. I felt that if I moved, if I took one more step, something horrible would happen. But I had to know what it was. I reached for the light switch and turned it on. The room was empty. There was no shadow, no one. But the wardrobe was slightly open, as if it had been tampered with. I approached, my heart pounding in my chest, and opened the wardrobe door. It was empty except for one object, a photograph. I picked up the photo with trembling hands. It was an image of my living room. In the photo, there was a dark figure standing exactly where I had been sitting moments ago. I dropped the photo on the floor and took a step back, trying to understand what was happening. That's when I felt a cold breath on my neck. My body froze. I knew I wasn't alone. Slowly, I turned my head to look behind me, and there it was. A tall, thin figure with a pale face and dark eyes staring right at me. Its smile was distorted, as if it wasn't human. The bedroom light started to flicker, and everything around me seemed to blur into a mix of darkness and light. I tried to scream, but no sound came out of my mouth. Then, everything went black. I woke up hours later, lying on the living room floor. The door to my apartment was open, and the photograph I had found in the wardrobe was next to me, but now the image was different. Instead of showing the living room, it showed my bedroom, and I was lying on the floor, exactly as I was at that moment. Since that night, I have never felt safe in my own home. The feeling of being watched has never left me, and every night, the whispers return. Sometimes, I see the shadow in the corner of the room. Other times, I feel that cold breath on my neck. I moved to a new apartment, a new city, but none of that helped. It seems like it follows me, watches me, waiting for the right moment to take me wherever it came from. And I know that one day, when I'm most vulnerable, it will succeed. So if you ever hear whispers in your house or feel a presence that shouldn't be there, don't ignore it. Because sometimes what seems like just an irrational fear can be something very, very real. I had always been a skeptic when it came to the paranormal, Ghost stories, haunted houses, and eerie urban legends never fazed me. That all changed one summer when I decided to house sit for my aunt while she was away on vacation. Her house was a big, old Victorian-style home in a small town, far removed from the bustling city life I was used to. It had been in the family for generations, and everyone in town said it was haunted, though I never believed a word of it. The first night was uneventful. I made myself dinner, watched some TV, and went to bed in the guest room. The house was eerily quiet at night, but I told myself it was just the isolation playing tricks on my mind. Around 3 a.m., however, I woke up to the sound of footsteps. They were faint but unmistakable, coming from the hallway outside my door. My heart pounded in my chest as I listened. The footsteps stopped right in front of my door. I held my breath, waiting for what felt like an eternity, but nothing happened. Gathering my courage, I got up and opened the door. The hallway was empty. I flipped on the lights, expecting to see someone or something, but there was nothing. I checked all the rooms and even went downstairs, but the house was silent and still. Trying to brush off the incident, I convinced myself it was just the old house settling. The next day passed without incident. I almost forgot about the footsteps. That night, I locked all the doors and windows and went to bed early, determined to get a good night's sleep. But once again, at around 3 a.m., I woke up to the sound of footsteps. This time, they were louder, more distinct, and they didn't stop at my door. They continued down the hallway, growing fainter as if someone was walking away. I decided to follow the sound. I got out of bed, my hands shaking, and stepped into the hallway. I could still hear the footsteps, now seemingly coming from the stairs. I crept towards the staircase and looked down. For a split second, I saw a shadowy figure at the bottom of the stairs. It was just standing there, facing away from me. I blinked and it was gone. My blood ran cold. I backed away slowly, retreating into my room. I didn't sleep for the rest of the night. In the morning, I tried to rationalize what I saw. Maybe it was a trick of the light, or perhaps I was half asleep and imagined it. But the fear was real, and I couldn't shake it off. The third night, I was on edge, dreading what would happen at 3 a.m. I left all the lights on in the house, hoping it would keep whatever was haunting the place at bay. But when the clock struck 3, the lights flickered and went out. My heart dropped. I was plunged into darkness. Then, the footsteps started again. This time, they were faster, more frantic, and they were coming straight towards my room. I felt paralyzed, unable to move or even scream. The footsteps stopped right outside my door, and then the doorknob started to turn. I grabbed my phone and turned on the flashlight, pointing it at the door. The doorknob was rattling violently now, as if someone or something was trying to get in. I backed up against the wall, my breath coming in short, panicked gasps. Suddenly, the rattling stopped. The room was deathly silent. I didn't dare move. I just stood there, my phone's flashlight pointed at the door, waiting for what felt like hours. Finally, I mustered the courage to approach the door. I reached out and yanked it open, shining my flashlight into the hallway. It was empty. But then I noticed something that made my blood freeze. The hallway floor, covered in a thin layer of dust, had footprints on it. Fresh, wet footprints that led from my door, down the stairs and into the living room. They weren't mine. I had been barefoot the whole time, and these footprints were large, with a distinct pattern that looked like heavy boots. I followed the trail of footprints cautiously. They led me to the living room, where they stopped abruptly in front of the old fireplace. There, on the mantel, was a photograph I had never seen before. It was a faded black and white picture of a man, tall and gaunt, wearing what looked like a long coat and a hat. His eyes were hollow, almost completely black, and he was staring directly at the camera. I felt a chill run down my spine as I stared at the photo. I had no idea who this man was, but I had the unnerving feeling that he had been the one walking the hallways. I didn't wait to find out more. I grabbed my things, ran out of the house, and drove to the nearest motel. I didn't care if it was the middle of the night. The next day, I called my aunt and told her what happened. There was a long silence on the other end of the line before she finally spoke. "I was hoping you wouldn't see him," she said quietly. She went on to explain that the house had always been haunted by a spirit they called the Watcher. He had been seen by almost every member of the family at some point, always around 3 a.m., always walking the hallways. My aunt had hoped that by leaving the house empty, the watcher would lose interest and leave. Clearly, that hadn't happened. I refused to go back to the house. My aunt eventually had the house blessed and cleansed by a priest, but the sightings never stopped completely. To this day, I still wake up at 3 a.m. sometimes, expecting to hear those footsteps. And every time I visit my aunt, I can't bring myself to go near that old Victorian house, because I know somewhere in its dark hallways, the watcher is still there, walking, waiting. I've always been a rational person, the kind who needs to see things to believe them. My friends love telling ghost stories, but I usually just rolled my eyes and laughed it off. That was until last year, when something happened that I still can't fully explain. It was late October, and I had just moved into a small, one-bedroom apartment on the outskirts of town. The rent was cheap and the building was old, but I didn't mind. It had character, and the landlord assured me there were no issues. I was looking forward to having my own space. The first few nights were uneventful. I unpacked, settled in, and enjoyed the peace and quiet. But after a week, things started to change. It began with small, almost unnoticeable things. I would wake up in the morning to find that my kitchen cabinets were open, even though I knew I had closed them before going to bed. I blamed it on my forgetfulness. Maybe I was just too tired and left them open without realizing it. But then, one night, I heard a noise. I was lying in bed, half asleep, when I heard the distinct sound of footsteps in the hallway outside my bedroom. At first, I thought it was one of my neighbors, but then I remembered that the hallway in question was inside my apartment. My heart started to race. I lay there listening intently. The footsteps were slow and deliberate, like someone was taking their time, making sure each step was heard. They moved closer and closer until they stopped right outside my bedroom door. I felt a wave of fear wash over me. I was too scared to move, too scared to even breathe. The doorknob rattled slightly, as if someone was testing it, seeing if it was locked. I squeezed my eyes shut, my heart pounding so hard I thought it would burst out of my chest. I stayed like that for what felt like hours, waiting for something to happen. But nothing did. Eventually, the footsteps moved away, fading into silence. The next morning, I convinced myself it was just a vivid dream, a manifestation of the stress of moving to a new place. But deep down, I knew something was off. I started paying more attention to the strange occurrences around the apartment. The cabinets continued to open on their own, and occasionally I would hear faint whispers, just on the edge of perception. Too quiet to understand, but unmistakably real. One night, things escalated. I had just gotten into bed, turning off the light, when I heard a creaking sound coming from the living room. It was the sound of the old wooden floor, the kind of noise it made when someone heavy stepped on it. I held my breath and listened. The creaking continued, getting louder and closer. I decided I couldn't just lie there this time. I needed to see what was causing the noise. I grabbed my phone and turned on the flashlight. Slowly, I got out of bed and made my way to the bedroom door. My hand was shaking as I reached for the doorknob. I turned it as quietly as possible and pulled the door open. The hallway was dark. I shone the flashlight into the living room, and for a moment I saw nothing. But then, in the corner of the room, near the window, I saw it. A figure, tall, shadowy, and completely still. It was standing there, just standing, almost as if it were waiting for me. I couldn't make out any features, just the outline of what looked like a person. I froze, my mind racing. Was this a break-in? But how had they gotten inside? Before I could react, the figure moved. It didn't walk or run. It glided across the room towards me. I stumbled back into the bedroom, slamming the door shut. My hands were shaking so badly I could barely lock it. I stood there in the darkness, my back pressed against the door, flashlight pointing at the floor, my heart hammering in my chest. I listened. Nothing. Just silence. After a few minutes, I gathered enough courage to look through the keyhole. I peered into the hallway, expecting to see the figure standing there, but it was empty. I stayed locked in my bedroom until the first light of dawn. When morning came, I searched the entire apartment, but there was no sign of an intruder, no evidence that anyone had been there. But on the living room window, there was something new, a handprint. It was smudged and faint, but it was there, pressed against the glass from the inside. My blood ran cold. The handprint was larger than mine, with long, thin fingers that looked almost inhuman. That was the last straw. I packed a bag and left the apartment, not even bothering to take most of my things. I went to stay with a friend and didn't go back to the apartment alone. When I returned a few days later with my brother to get the rest of my stuff, we found something even more disturbing. The apartment was freezing cold, like someone had left a window open in the dead of winter, but every window was closed and locked. As we gathered my things, we both heard it. Soft whispers coming from the hallway. We didn't stick around to investigate. We grabbed what we could and left as quickly as possible. I broke my lease and never went back. The landlord later called me, asking why I left so suddenly. I hesitated, but then told him everything that happened. There was a long pause on the other end of the line before he finally spoke. "You're not the first tenant to experience this," he admitted. "That apartment, there have been incidents, people seeing things, hearing noises. We've had it blessed and cleansed, but it never stops." He apologized and offered a partial refund on the rent. I didn't care about the money. I was just glad to be out of there. Since then, I've been living in a new place, far away from that apartment. I try to tell myself it was just my imagination, that the stress of moving to a new place got the best of me. But every now and then, late at night, when the house is quiet, I think I hear it again, the faint sound of footsteps outside my bedroom door, followed by a whisper that sends chills down my spine.